A widow stood alone in the freezing wind, a single folded letter trembling in her bare, reddened hands. 11 years of marriage, a whole life built room by room, season by season, and a stranger's pen had just closed it all out, like a number crossed from a ledger. A handful of days to vanish, a few thin coins, set against everything she had ever loved. The mountains were already turning white, the high passes were closing, and one by one, every door in that hard valley had quietly shut against her. They expected her to disappear, to board a train, or freeze somewhere in the dark, and trouble no one, ever again. But high above the valley, behind a curtain of ancient juniper, a crack in the bare granite was waiting. And the woman they had thrown away was about to do the one thing no one believed she could survive. A woman made of granite. A widow stood alone in the freezing wind, her shawl pulled tight across her shoulders, her breath rising in thin pale ribbons that the cold tore away almost before they formed. Below her, the valley lay silent. Above her, the mountains kept their old indifferent watch. And in her bare hands, reddened by the chill, she held a single folded letter. She did not open it. Not yet. She only stood there on the worn wooden porch, listening to the wind move through the bare aspens on the far slope. Those trees that had already let go of their gold, standing now like thin gray bones against a sky the color of a deep, fading bruise. The boy who had brought the letter was already gone. He had handed it to her the way a person hands over something they are afraid to hold. Something fragile, something with edges. He had not met her eyes. He had simply pressed the envelope into her palm, nodded once, and hurried back down the frozen path, his small boots slipping on the hard ground. She had watched him go, and then she had turned the envelope over in her fingers, slowly, feeling the weight of it. Such a small thing, so light it was almost nothing. And yet she already knew. Her name was Cora Hale, and in that high, hard country, where the towns clung to the mountainsides like stubborn moss, she had once been a wife, a keeper of a small, warm house, a woman who set bread to rise on winter mornings and watched the steam fog the cold windows while her husband laced his boots by the door. That was before the mountain took him. The house behind her had been cold for 3 months now. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season. It was the particular cold of a house where the laughter had stopped, where the second chair at the table sat empty, where a man's coat still hung on its hook by the door because no one had yet found the strength to take it down. Her husband had been a good man, a quiet man, a man who read the mountains the way other men read scripture, with patience and a strange, tender reverence. His name had been Elias, and one ordinary morning, in the dark of the high north face, the rock had come down without warning. Tons of it. A whole shoulder of the mountain giving way at once. The men who dug him out came home gray-faced and silent. The company called it a miscalculation, a flaw in the rock, a regrettable event. Cora had a different word for it. She called it the day the world ended, and then went right on turning, as if nothing at all had been lost. Now she stood on the porch with the letter, and she did not weep. She had no tears left for this. The grief that had hollowed her out over the summer had taken everything, and what remained was something harder, something still, a stillness that frightened the few people who came near her because they could not read it. She slid one finger beneath the flap and opened the envelope. The paper inside was clean and white. Official. The kind of paper that meant a decision had already been made by men in a warm room far away. Men who had never once climbed this mountain or felt this wind. The words were polite. That was the cruelty of it. The politeness. The letter expressed its regret for her loss. It expressed it the way a ledger expresses a number. It noted that the house in which she stood had been provided for the use of an employee. It noted that the employee was deceased, and it noted, in language as smooth and cold as river ice, that she would be required to leave. A handful of days. That was all she was given, and at the bottom, an offer. A small sum of money to be paid upon her departure, to assist with her relocation. A few coins and bills set against 11 years of marriage, set against every meal she had cooked in that kitchen, every fever she had nursed through long nights, every winter she had survived in that thin-walled house. 11 years, closed out like an account. She read it once, and then, slowly, she read it again, as if the second reading might soften the first. It did not. The signature at the bottom was a single hard slash of black ink. A name she knew. The name of the man who ran the company's operations in that valley. A man named Silas Crane. She folded the letter back along its creases. Her hands did not shake. And that, perhaps, was the most frightening thing of all. Inside the house, the silence waited for her. She closed the door against the wind and stood for a moment in the dim front room, letting her eyes adjust. The fire had burned low. The light through the small windows was thin and gray. Everywhere she looked, there was a ghost. The table he had built with his own hands from 2 wide planks of mountain pine, sanded smooth over long evenings. The shelf where his books still leaned together, their spines worn soft. The chair by the stove, where he used to sit after supper, turning the pages of his journal, sketching the things he had seen on the high slopes. She crossed the room and sat down at the table. She placed the letter in front of her, and for a long while she simply looked at the wall, at the fine map of cracks in the old plaster, a map she had memorized over the years the way a person memorizes the lines on the back of their own hand. That house was no longer hers. The wind found the gaps in the walls and slipped inside, and she felt it move across her ankles like cold water. A weaker woman might have lain down then, might have pulled the blankets over her head and waited for the end to come and take her too. But Cora Hale was not made that way. Somewhere in the long, frozen months of her grief, something inside her had hardened. Not into bitterness, but into resolve. Into a kind of quiet that was not surrender, but preparation. She would not lie down. She would not let them write her off like a debt to be settled. But she did not yet know how. That night, she did not sleep. She sat at the table with a stub of pencil and a sheet of brown butcher paper, and she did the only thing she knew how to do when the world turned cruel. She faced it with numbers. She wrote down what she had. Every coin in the small tin box beneath the loose floorboard. The little the company would give her when she left. She added the figures slowly, twice, to be certain. It was not much. It was the kind of sum that stood between a person and the open mountain in the dead of winter, and lost. Beneath that, she wrote what stood against her. Her age. She was a woman of middle years, old enough that the easy work, the scrubbing and the hauling and the long days of labor in other people's houses went now to younger backs, girls of 16 and 18, strong and tireless. The town had no use for a widow past her youth. She had no family near. Her people were long buried, far away. Her husband's people were across an ocean and knew her only as a name in his letters. She was alone. And she wrote that down too, in her small, careful hand, because she had learned that a problem only grows in the dark and shrinks a little when you drag it into the light and look at it plainly. Alone. The pencil paused over the paper. And then there was the season. It was deep autumn now, on the cusp of true winter. The first heavy snows could come any day, and when they came, they would close the high passes, seal the valleys shut, and lock the world away behind walls of white until the spring. She had perhaps a handful of weeks, no more. She drew a line beneath her troubles and began to write her choices. She could go down to one of the cities on the plains. She had been to such a place once, long ago, on her husband's arm. A loud, smoking sprawl of brick and noise. She could spend nearly everything she had on the journey and arrive a stranger, friendless, competing against 1,000 other women in the same gray straits, with the little money in her pocket draining away week by week until it was gone. And then what? She knew what. She had seen what became of women who ran out of money in cities with no one to catch them. She drew a slow, firm line through that choice. She could stay in the town, but the town was a single machine, built around the mine. You worked for the company, or you served those who did. With her husband gone, she was a part that no longer fit. There was no room for her, no spare corner. Every household was already stretched to its last thread. She drew a line through that one too. When she was done, she sat back and looked at the page. Every road led to the same place, ruin. For one long moment, sitting alone in that cold and dying house, a wave of something rose up in her so large and so dark that it stole the breath from her chest. It was the feeling of being erased, of being weighed by the world and found to be worth nothing at all. It was dizzying. It was almost sweet, the way the edge of a cliff is almost sweet when you are very, very tired. She closed her eyes. She breathed. And then, slowly, she pushed it down. Because self-pity, she had long ago decided, was a fire that burned all your fuel and gave back no heat. She opened her eyes, and she looked again at the page, at the 3 tidy choices, all crossed out. Those were the roads the world offered a woman like her. And every one of them was a dead end. So, if the ordinary roads led only to ruin, then she would have to find a road that was not ordinary. She did not yet know what that meant, but for the first time in months, something flickered in her chest that was not grief. It was a question. The next day, she made herself go and see him. She put on her good dress, the dark one, and she pinned her hair, and she walked down the frozen track to the low building where the company kept its offices. Her chin was level. Her hands were steady inside her worn gloves. She would not beg, but she would ask, once, plainly, because pride was a luxury, and she could not yet afford to leave any door unopened. The man named Silas Crane sat behind a wide desk in a warm room that smelled of pipe smoke and ink. He was a man of comfortable middle age, soft in the way that men become soft when other men do their lifting for them. He did not rise when she entered. He did not offer her a chair. He looked at her over a pair of small spectacles, the way a man looks at a column of figures that has come out wrong. "Mrs. Hale," he said. That was all. She told him why she had come. She kept her voice level and her words few. She said she was willing to work, any work, that she was strong and capable, and asked only for a place, a way to earn her keep through the winter. He let her finish, and then he was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she understood, before he said a single word, exactly how this would go. "The town," he said at last, folding his hands upon the desk, "does not keep what it cannot use." He said it gently. That was the worst of it. He said it the way a man remarks upon the weather, as if it were simply a fact of the world, neither kind nor cruel, but only true, as if she were a tool that had outlived its purpose, and he were merely explaining why she must be set aside. "Your husband was a fine worker," he went on. "We were sorry to lose him, but sentiment is not a column we are able to balance." Cora stood very still. She looked at this man in his warm room, with his pipe and his clean hands and his sorrow that cost him nothing. And she felt something turn over inside her. Not rage. Rage was loud, and rage burned out fast. What she felt was colder than that, and far more lasting. It was the feeling of a line being drawn. A clean, quiet line between the person she had been before she walked into that room and the person she would have to become to survive what came after. "I see," she said. Only that. She did not argue. She did not plead. She had her answer, and she had her dignity, and she would not trade the second for the small mercy of the first. She turned to go, and at the door she paused, just for a moment. "You'll have your house back," she said without looking around. "I'll trouble you no further." And then she was gone, out into the cold, the door swinging shut behind her on the warm room and the small cruelty that he would forget before his pipe had even gone out. He would remember her, though, in time. But that was a story not yet written. She walked back up the mountain track with the wind in her face, and she did not let herself cry, because crying would freeze on her cheeks, and she had work to do. That evening, she began to pack. If she was to leave that house, then she would leave it the way she did everything. Carefully, completely, wasting nothing. She moved through the rooms by lamplight, wrapping what was worth keeping, setting aside what was not. The good skillet, the 2 pots, a knife, a cup, a plate, the wool blankets, her own quilt, the one her mother had made, faded now, but still warm. And then she came to his things. She had not been able to touch them all summer. They had sat untouched on their shelf and their hooks, gathering the fine gray dust of a house where no one had the heart to clean. She made herself begin. His shirts, worn soft at the elbows, smelling still, faintly, of him, of pine smoke and cold stone, and the particular warmth of his skin. She folded each one slowly. His heavy boots, the leather cracked from 100 climbs, his spare hammer, the small, ordinary tools of an ordinary, extraordinary life. She packed them into a wooden crate, and with each thing she set inside, she said a small and silent goodbye. And then she reached the shelf of his books. He had loved his books, not the company's manuals, the dry pages on ore and timber and yield. Those he had kept for work. These were his own. A volume of poetry, the pages soft from handling. A book about the bones of the earth, full of strange and beautiful drawings of rock and time. And there, tucked between 2 of them, half hidden, was a small thing bound in worn leather. No title on its cover, no mark. His journal. She lifted it down with both hands. He had called it his book of noticings. She remembered him bent over it at this very table, in the soft circle of the lamplight, the pencil moving in slow and careful strokes, while the fire ticked in the stove, and the night pressed black against the windows. She had thought it a small and private habit, a way for a quiet man to keep his quiet thoughts. She had never once looked inside. It had felt like reading his prayers. But he was gone now, and the prayers were all that remained. She sat down at the table, and by the light of the single lamp, she opened the journal of her dead husband. And there he was, page after page, alive in his own neat, angular hand. Sketches of rock and root and feather. Notes on the way the light fell on the high meadows in the late summer. A drawing of a single mountain flower he had found near a far summit, rendered so tenderly that she had to stop and press her hand flat against the page, as if she could feel, through the paper, the warmth of the hand that had drawn it. He had loved this country. He had loved it the way some men love a woman, helplessly, completely, with his whole attention. She turned the pages slowly, and it was the most intimate thing she had ever done, walking, page by page, through the private inner country of the man she had loved and lost. There were tears on her face now, and she let them come, because there was no one to see, and because some grief is too large to be pushed down, and must simply be allowed to pass through. And then she turned a page and stopped. At the top, in his careful letters, he had written a heading, a name for something he had found, and below it, a drawing. A long, narrow crack in a great wall of granite, high on a south-facing slope, half hidden behind the dark sprawl of an ancient juniper tree. His notes filled the margins. She leaned closer. He had written about that crack in the rock the way a scientist writes, and the way a poet writes, both at once. He described its size, its shape, the way it opened beyond its narrow mouth, into a larger, hollow chamber within the mountain itself. But it was the rest of his words that made her breath catch in her throat. He had written about how the opening faced the low winter sun, how it would drink in the light through the short cold days, how the great mass of the surrounding stone would hold that warmth, soaking it in slowly, like a vast and patient body, and giving it back again, hour by hour, through the long freezing dark. He had written that even on the bitterest day, when the world outside turned to killing cold. The air inside that hollow of stone would hold above freezing. A natural shelter, he had written, a house the mountain built for itself. And below the words, he had drawn a small map, a path, landmarks she could follow, a lightning-scarred pine, a count of steps, a curtain of juniper. All of it laid down in his patient, loving hand, for no reason at all except that he had found a beautiful thing and could not bear to let it go unrecorded. He could not have known. He could not possibly have known, on the bright summer day he climbed that slope and knelt before that crack in the stone and took out his pencil, that he was not sketching a curiosity at all. He was drawing a way for his wife to live. He was leaving her an inheritance worth more than any coin the company would ever count out across a desk. He was reaching back, across the wall between the living and the dead, to press something into her hands one last time. Cora sat very still in the lamplight, the journal open before her, her husband's voice rising off the page in his own careful letters. And slowly, something began to change in her face. The stillness was still there, but behind it now, like the first gray light behind a winter ridge, there was something else. There was a plan. Wild. Impossible. The kind of thing no sensible woman would ever attempt. A widow. Alone. Walking up into the high country as winter closed its fist. To make a home inside the bones of a mountain. It should have frightened her. Instead, for the first time since the rock had come down and taken the center out of her world, she felt the cold weight in her chest begin to lift. She traced the lines of his handwriting with the tip of one finger, following the loops and angles the way she had once traced the line of his jaw in the dark. "You always did notice everything," she whispered. The only words she spoke aloud that night. And the lamp burned on, and the wind searched the walls of the dying house, and outside the first hard stars came out over the mountains, sharp and cold and very far away. She closed the journal. She held it against her chest for a long moment, both hands flat against the worn leather, as if she could press it into her own heart. And then she rose from the table. There was work to do now, real work. A list to make and supplies to gather and a deadline pressing down on her like the coming snow. The few days she had been given would not be days of mourning anymore. They would be days of preparation. She would gather what she needed. She would say her goodbyes to a house that had stopped being hers. And then, before the first great storm could close the passes and seal the valley shut, she would climb. She moved through the cold rooms by lamplight, and her step was different now, lighter, and at the same time more certain. The step of a woman who has stopped waiting to be saved, because she has understood, at last, that no one is coming. No one was coming. She had known that for a long time, if she was honest. Since the morning they carried him down off the mountain. Since the letter. Since Crane had drawn his quiet line through her life with the slash of a single pen. No one was coming to save her, so she would do the only thing left to do. She would save herself. Outside, the wind died down at last, and a great silence settled over the valley. The deep, listening silence that comes before snow. The mountains stood black against the stars, patient and ancient and unmoved by the small, fierce thing taking shape in the heart of the woman below them. She set the journal on the table, beside the crossed-out list and the cold, white letter. 3 pieces of paper, one that closed a door, one that mapped a dead end, and one, in a dead man's loving hand, that opened a road no one else could see. Cora Hale looked at the 3 of them for a long moment in the lamplight. Then she picked up the journal, and the journal alone, and she slipped it into the pocket over her heart. She left the letter on the table, and she did not look at it again. Tomorrow, she would begin. Tomorrow, she would walk into the general store with her small fortune in her hand and buy the tools of her survival, one by one. Tomorrow, she would shoulder her burden and turn her back on the only life she had ever known, and set her face toward the high, cold slope where a crack in the granite waited for her. A house half built by the mountain, and finished, she vowed, by her own 2 hands. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, she banked the last of the fire, and she lay down in the cold bed for the final time, and she pulled the quilt her mother had made up to her chin, and she stared into the dark. She was not afraid. That was the strange thing. She searched herself for the old fear, the fear that had ridden her all through the long gray summer, and she could not find it. In its place was something she had not felt in a very long while. Something that felt almost like hope. Not the soft and foolish hope of a girl. Not the hope that things would be given to her, or done for her, or made easy. A harder hope than that. The hope of a woman who has finally seen the shape of the thing she must do, and has decided in the deep and quiet center of herself that she is equal to it. The mountain had taken her husband. The men in the warm rooms had taken her home. The world had weighed her and crossed her out and turned its back. Let them. She had a map now, drawn in a beloved hand. She had her two strong hands and her clear, cold mind, and the long, hard patience that the high country teaches to those who survive it. And somewhere above her, in the dark, a hollow of ancient stone was waiting to be made into a home. She closed her eyes, and in the last house of her old life, the widow slept, while outside, soft and silent and certain, the first snow of the winter began, at last, to fall. The snow that fell in the night did not stay. By morning, it was only a thin white dusting on the frozen track, the kind that crunches underfoot and melts to nothing where the sun touches it. But Cora Hale knew it for what it was. A warning. A first knock at the door from the long, dark guest that was coming whether she was ready or not. So she did not waste the morning. She rose before the light. She dressed in her warmest things, layered one over another. She wrapped her small fortune of coins and folded bills into a square of cloth and tucked it deep inside her coat, against her ribs, where she could feel it. And then she shouldered what little she meant to carry down, and she walked the frozen path into the heart of the town one last time. The store sat at the center of everything. It was an old building, low and broad, its boards gone silver with weather, its single front window crowded with the 100 small necessities of a hard life. Rope and lamp oil, salt and seed. The smell of it, when she stepped inside, was the smell of the whole world she was about to leave. Dried goods and leather and wood smoke, and the sweet, sharp bite of pickling brine. The man who kept the store was very old. His age was written in the soft web of lines around his eyes, and in the slow, deliberate way he moved, as though he were spending a small fixed allowance of strength and meant to make it last the day. His name was Bram. He had known her husband well. The two of them had passed many a slow hour on the bench outside that store, sharing a pipe, saying little, watching the light change on the mountains. He had liked Elias. Everyone had liked Elias. He looked up when the bell above the door gave its small tin cry, and he saw her. He saw the bundle in her arms. He saw the set of her jaw, the straightness of her back, the terrible, quiet finality in her eyes. He had been a long time in that country, and he had seen that look before, on the faces of people about to do hard things alone. He did not ask her what had happened. He already knew. "Mrs. Hale," he said gently, and then, more gently still, "What can I get for you?" She told him. She had made her list in the night, by lamplight, weighing each item against the small weight of her purse, and now she read it out, low and even, and with each thing she named, the old man moved to fetch it, his slow hands steady and sure. A small iron stove, the compact one, made to throw its heat into a tight space and waste none of it. Lengths of pipe to carry the smoke, the bent joints to angle it. A good shovel with a solid handle. A pick for breaking frozen ground. A saw with a spare blade, because a blade can break, and there is no store on a mountainside. She was building an arsenal. Each thing she named was a weapon in a war that had not yet begun. A long, slow, freezing war against the winter, and she meant to walk into it armed. Flour, beans, a slab of salt pork, lard, a canister of salt, coffee, because even a soldier needs one small comfort, a great box of matches, and cartridges, a full 100 of them, for the rifle that had been her husband's and was now hers. The pile on the worn counter grew. The old man tallied it all on a slip of paper, his pencil moving with the same unhurried patience as his hands. And when he reached the bottom of the list and added it up, the number he spoke aloud was a hard one. It took a great deal of what she had, but she did not flinch. She counted out the money and laid it on the counter between them, coin by coin, bill by bill. And it was not only money that passed across that scarred wood. It was trust. It was a woman placing the last of everything she owned into a single desperate plan, and an old man watching her do it without once asking her to explain herself. He boxed her supplies with care, and then, when he had nearly finished, he stopped. "Wait here," he said. "Just a moment." And he disappeared into the dim back of the store. He was gone a little while. She heard him moving things, the soft thump of goods being shifted. And when he came back, he was carrying two things in his arms: a heavy gray wool blanket, thick and warm, and a great folded square of oiled canvas, stiff and dark, the kind made to turn rain and wind and snow. He set them both down on the counter in front of her. "Found these in the back," he said. His voice was easy, careless almost. "Part of a load that came in damaged. Can't sell them new." He smoothed the wool with one old hand. "Call it $1, he said. "For the pair." Cora looked at the blanket. She looked at the canvas. And she knew with perfect certainty exactly what they were worth. The blanket alone was worth many times $1. The canvas, far more than that. There was nothing wrong with either of them. Not a tear, not a stain, not a flaw. She understood what he was doing. He was helping her, but he was helping her in the only way a proud woman would let herself be helped, in a way that let her keep her chin up and her dignity whole. He was not handing her charity across a counter. He was selling her damaged goods at a fair price for damaged goods. It was a kindness dressed up as a transaction, so that she would not have to refuse it. She hesitated, and the old man saw the hesitation, and he understood it too. And he leaned in just slightly and lowered his voice. "Your husband," he said, "was a good man." He paused. "Pulled my boy out of the deep snow up on the high pass one winter, years back now. Carried him down the whole way on his own back. My boy would have died up there, if not for Elias Hale." He straightened. "The high country," he said, "looks after its own." And before she could find any words at all, he had added a small whetstone to her box and a fat sack of mixed nails, and waved a hand at her when she opened her mouth. "No charge for those," he said. "Sweepings. They'd only go in the bin." She paid the $1. She did not argue, because she understood that to refuse him would be to take something from him too, the small dignity of being able to help a friend's widow without shaming her. And she would not do that. Not to this old man, with his kind eyes and his slow hands and his quiet grief for a good man gone. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, but she meant them with everything she had. He helped her load it all onto a small handcart, the kind a man wheels his goods home in. He set it by the door for her. "You bring that cart back," he said, "when you're done with it." And there it was. Hidden inside that simple instruction was something enormous. He was not saying goodbye. He was not telling her to go off and die somewhere quiet and out of the way. He was telling her he expected her to live. He was placing a bet, with his own cart as the stake, on her survival. He expected to see her again. She gripped the handle of the cart, and as she pulled it out into the cold, the bell crying once more above the door, she carried the weight of that old man's quiet faith in her. And she found that it steadied her, the way a stone in the pocket steadies a small boat against the wind. She did not look back at the town. She set her face toward the high ground, and she began to climb. The way up was long, and it was hard, and the cart was a brute. She could only take it so far. Where the track gave out and the real climbing began, she left it lashed to a tree and went on by foot, carrying her supplies up in load after load, trip after trip, her breath sawing in the thin, cold air. The first part of the climb went through dark timber on the shadowed face of the slope, where the sun never reached and the ground stayed frozen hard all year. The snow lay deeper there, gray and old, clinging to the moss and the rocks. It was slow going, slippery and cruel, but she had her husband's map. She had it by heart now. She had read it so many times in the lamplight that she could see it with her eyes closed. Every landmark, every turning, every careful note in his patient hand. So she did not falter. She climbed steadily, conserving her strength, never rushing, watching the land unfold around her exactly as he had described it. And when she reached the high saddle he had marked, the narrow gap between 2 great fists of granite, she stopped and rested and ate a little bread and went on. And then the world changed. The path curved around to the sunlit face of the ridge, and all at once the dark, cold timber fell away behind her. Here the light came down full and warm. The old snow was gone. The ground was dry and bare, and almost warm beneath her hand when she knelt to touch it. The air filled with the clean, sharp smell of sun-warmed pine and juniper, and below her, far below, the whole valley spread out like something seen in a dream. The little, scattered houses, the dark wound of the mine, the thin lines of the tracks, all of it grown small and toy-like and far away. She stood there a long moment, catching her breath, looking down. And she felt a strange thing. She felt herself stepping out of one world and into another, out of the world of men and ledgers and warm rooms and quiet cruelties, and into something older, something that had been there long before any of them, and would be there long after. She turned her back on the valley, and she went to find the door. She found the lightning-struck pine just where he had said it would be. A tall, ruined giant, its crown blasted long ago into a black and jagged spear that pointed at the sky. From there, his instructions were exact. A count of steps due west, the spine of the ridge kept at her right shoulder. She counted them off, her boots crunching on the dry stone and loose scree. And when she reached the number he had written, she stopped and lifted her eyes, and her heart sank. Before her rose a high wall of gray granite, cracked and weathered by 10,000 winters, and clinging to the face of it, sprawling and dense and dark, was a great old juniper, its branches a tangled green curtain that hid the rock behind. It looked solid. It looked like nothing at all. For one cold moment, she thought she had come all this way, carried all this weight, up all this mountain, to a wall. But her husband had never once been careless, so she stepped close, and she reached out, and she took hold of a heavy, fragrant branch, and she pushed it aside, and there it was, exactly as he had drawn it, a narrow crack in the stone, a dark vertical slice, no wider than her shoulders, half hidden behind the juniper's reaching arms. It did not look like a way in. It looked like a flaw, a place where the mountain had simply broken long ago. But she knew better now. She drew a slow breath. She turned herself sideways. She pressed her shoulders together, and she slipped inside. The first stretch was tight and close, the cold rock rough against her coat on either side. 10 feet, perhaps, of that narrow squeeze, with the light shrinking behind her. And then the world opened. She stepped out of the crack and into a chamber. It was still. It was utterly, perfectly still, in a way that nothing in the open world ever is. The light from the narrow door reached only a little way inside, and beyond it, the dark stretched back into cool shadow. The air was dry. It smelled of stone and of dust, and of the deep, patient cold of the mountain's own heart. She stood very still, letting her eyes find the shape of the place. It was larger than she had dared to hope, wide enough, deep enough. The ceiling, a single vast slab of granite, rose high at the back and sloped down toward the door. The floor was packed earth and stone dust, and it was almost level. Almost, she thought, as if it had been waiting. She walked to the far wall. She looked up, and there, high above, near the ceiling, was a second crack, a narrow flue, angling up and away through the stone, where the air moved, sluggish, but steady. A natural chimney, a way for the smoke to leave. He had seen all of it. He had seen it and understood it, and written it down, never once dreaming what it would come to mean. She placed her bare hand flat against the granite wall. It was cool, but it was not the wet, seeping, deadly cold of a cellar. It was the dry, deep, solid cold of an enormous, still thing. And she understood, with her hand on the stone, what her husband had meant when he wrote of its thermal mass, of how it would drink the heat and hold it, and give it slowly back. The stone was a great cold body now, but it could be warmed. It could be made into something that held warmth the way a banked fire holds an ember through the night. She turned slowly in the dim chamber, and she looked at all of it, and a feeling rose up in her that she had not felt in so long she barely knew its name. It was relief. She had not found a cave. She had found a house, rough and unfinished, and waiting, and she would finish it. The work began that same day, and it did not stop for 6 long weeks. It was a labor unlike anything her life had ever asked of her, grinding, relentless, a single-minded toil that left no room in her mind for grief or fear or the soft, slow rot of self-pity. Each morning she rose with the first gray light. Each evening she worked until her arms shook and the sun dropped behind the western peaks, and the cold came down like a falling curtain. And in between, she built. Her first task was a wall. The chamber was too large to warm all at once, so following a thing her husband had once explained to her on a winter evening long ago, she set about dividing it, a smaller, warmer room at the back where she would live, and a colder outer space near the door for her stores. She gathered her stone from the broken slope below the entrance. It was brutal work. Each slab had to be pried from the frozen ground with her pick, tested, found sound, or thrown aside, and then carried, or dragged, or rolled up the slope to the door, one stone at a time. Her hands paid the price. They were soft hands, the hands of a woman who had kept a house, not split a mountain, and the work tore them apart. First the blisters rose, and then the blisters broke, and then the raw flesh beneath them cracked and bled in the dry, cold air. She wrapped them in strips of cloth, and she kept on, because soft hands could be made hard. That was the thing she came to understand, kneeling in the scree with the blood drying on her knuckles. The body was not fixed. It could be remade by the work you asked of it. And so, day by day, her broken hands healed wrong, healed thick and tough and strong, and became the hands of a different woman. She stacked the stones without mortar, fitting them dry, the way she had watched the masons fit them down in the town. She had a good eye. She found she had always had it. She learned to read the shape of a stone and know where it belonged, to wedge the small ones into the gaps so the whole rose true and would not shift. A few inches a day. No more. The wall climbed slowly, and as it climbed, the open cave became a room. It took her 9 days. When it was done, she stood back and looked at it. A low, solid barrier of fitted stone, the work of her own 2 hands, and she felt something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. She felt proud. The stove came next, and the stove was the heart of everything. This was the one thing she could not have made for herself. The one piece she had carried up the mountain on her own back, load by load, and setting it right was a matter of life and death. She chose its place with care, in the back corner of her new small room, directly beneath the natural flue in the ceiling. She built a level platform of flat stones for it to stand on, and then she wrestled the heavy iron thing into place, all by herself, with nothing but her own strength and a few clever tricks of leverage her husband had once shown her. Then came the pipe. She fitted the lengths together and used the bent joints to carry the smoke up toward the crack in the ceiling. And the last thing, the most important thing, was to seal the place where the pipe met the rock. For that, she dug clay from the bank of a small seep nearby, where a little water trickled even now from the frozen ground. She mixed it with water into a thick, gray, sticky mud, and she packed it tight around the pipe, forcing it into every crack and crevice, working it with her bare, healing fingers. It was not pretty, but when it dried, it would be hard as stone, and it would hold no draught and pass no flame. And while it cured, she turned to the door. The wind that funneled through the narrow opening was a thief. It stole the warmth as fast as she could make it, so she would shut it out. She felled 2 slim dead trees with her saw. She cut them into lengths, and with her hammer and the old man's nails, she built a frame, square and strong, if rough. Over it she stretched the heavy oiled canvas, that great gift bought for $1, and she nailed it tight. And she hung the whole thing in the narrowest part of the entrance, swinging it on hinges cut from an old leather belt that had been her husband's. It swung stiff, but it closed. And when it closed, the wind's voice dropped to a mutter, and the cold hand of it lifted from her skin. But the last task, the great task, the one that would matter most when the dark heart of the winter came, was wood. She became a hunter of it. She learned to read the forest the way her husband had read the rock. She learned to tell the dead, dry, standing timber, seasoned hard by years of sun and wind, from the wet and rotten stuff lying useless on the ground. She learned which trees would burn long and slow and which would flare and die. And then, for weeks, she did almost nothing else. She felled, she sawed, she split. The steady rhythm of the saw, the clean, sharp crack of the axe biting into a round of wood, the deep ache that settled into her back and her shoulders and became, in time, as familiar as her own heartbeat. These became the hours of her days, and now and then, on the bare, bright slopes between the timber and the snow line, the rifle that had been her husband's brought down a winter hare, and the fresh meat stretched her stores a little further into the dark, and she was glad, each time, for the 100 cartridges she had not let herself leave behind. She hauled the wood to the shelter, load after load, and she stacked it in the cold outer room with the care of a woman who knew that every stick was an hour of warmth, every armload a night of life. She sorted it as she stacked, the great dense logs at the bottom for the long, slow burning of the deepest night, the medium pieces in the middle for steady daytime heat, and the small split kindling at the top, ready to catch. And when at last she was done, the woodpile filled that outer chamber nearly to the ceiling, a wall of stored warmth, a fortress made of fuel, a monument to 6 weeks of a widow's labor raised against the coming dark. In the evenings, when the light failed and the work had to stop, she did not simply fall into sleep. She had a ritual. She would feed a single split log to the little stove and watch the firelight dance on the gray stone walls, and she would take out his journal, her husband's book of noticings, and she would read. By the light of one small candle, she would walk again through the inner country of his mind, his sketches, his notes, his patient, loving observations of a world he had loved with his whole quiet heart. And then she would turn to the blank pages at the back, and she would write. She wrote down the small data of her survival, the way he would have. How much wood she had burned that day, how cold it had been outside, and how warm within. How much of her flour remained, her beans, her salt pork. She kept her accounts the way he had kept his, in a small and careful hand. But it was more than accounting. It was a conversation. It was a way of speaking to him across the wall that death had built between them. A way of saying, Look what your noticing has done. Look what your love has built. The shelter you found, the shelter I am finishing, it works. It is working. We are doing this together, you and I, even now. She would write until the candle guttered, and then she would lie down, wrapped in her own quilt and his wool blankets, in the warm, small room inside the mountain's heart, and she would listen to the wind search the stone outside and find no way in. And for the first time since the day they carried him down, she was not afraid of the dark. But the town below had not forgotten her. Word had a way of traveling, even up a frozen mountainside. The old man would not have spoken of it, but others had seen her leave with her loaded cart. Others had wondered where the widow Hale had gone, and why she had not taken the long road down to the cities like a sensible woman. And the word reached Silas Crane in his warm and tidy office. It did not please him. He was a man who liked his ledgers balanced and his lines drawn clean. And there was something about the thought of that woman, that widow he had set aside with a stroke of his pen, still up there, somewhere on his company's mountain, refusing to be gone. That sat in him like a stone in a shoe. So he sent a man up to find her. The man came on a hard, bright afternoon, picking his way up the faint trail her own boots had beaten into the snow over weeks of climbing. He was a big man, used to being listened to, and he came to the mouth of her shelter with his thumbs hooked in his belt and a sneer already half formed on his mouth. She met him at the door. She did not invite him in. He looked at the canvas door set into the rock, at the thin, clean line of smoke rising from the flue, at the woman standing before him, her wrapped hands at her sides, her chin level, her eyes steady and cold as the stone behind her. And something in him faltered, just a little, at the sight of her. But he had his message to deliver, and he delivered it. This was company ground, he told her. This mountain, this rock, the timber she was cutting, and the very stone she was hiding in. All of it belonged to the company, and the company had not given her leave to be here. She was a trespasser, a squatter. She had no right. She listened. She did not interrupt. And when he was done, when he had said his piece and stood there waiting for her to wilt, she spoke just once, low and even. "Tell Mr. Crane," she said, "that the mountain was here before his company, and it will be here after, and he is welcome to come and remove me from it himself, if he can spare the time from his warm chair." The man stared at her. Then he laughed, a short, ugly bark of a laugh meant to wound. "They're calling you mad, you know," he said. "Down in the town, the mad widow, living in a crack in the rock like an animal, waiting to freeze." He shook his head. "You'll be dead by midwinter, woman. They'll find you froze stiff in there come spring." She did not answer that. She only looked at him, a long, level, unhurried look, until the grin slid off his face and he could not hold her eyes. And then she stepped back inside and let the heavy canvas door swing shut between them. She heard him stand there a moment in the cold. She heard him spit, and then she heard his boots crunching away, back down the trail, back to the soft, warm world below, where men drew lines through the lives of women they had never once tried to understand. She did not let his words touch her. Mad, they called her. Let them. Mad was only the word the small and frightened use for the thing they cannot do themselves. She fed another log to the stove, and she took out the journal, and she wrote down the day's wood and the day's cold and the day's small visit. And then, beneath it, she added one line that was not an accounting at all. "They think the cold will kill me," she wrote. "They do not understand. The cold is not my enemy now. The cold is only the test." And then the test came. It came on a morning that began strangely, with a thick yellow-gray light, and a deep, unnatural stillness in the air. The wind had died. The birds had gone quiet. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. She knew the signs. She had learned them these past weeks, the way the high country teaches its hard lessons to those who pay attention. So she did not wait either. She checked the seal on her pipe and found it hard and tight. She brought in an extra armload of wood and stacked it ready by the stove. She made certain her canvas door was latched and sound, and then she sat, and she watched the strange light through the gap at the edge of the door, and she waited for the mountain to make its first real attempt on her life. It did not keep her waiting long. By midday, the first flakes came drifting down, large and slow, and almost gentle. Lazy things tumbling out of that heavy sky. And then the wind woke up. It came from the high peaks with a low moan that climbed, within the hour, into a long rising shriek, tearing through the pines on the ridge above her. The lazy, drifting flakes became a wild white blur. The world outside her door simply vanished, swallowed whole in a roaring blindness of snow and wind. And the cold came down like a hammer. She felt the temperature falling. She could feel it through the very stone, the great cold body of the mountain leaning closer. This was it. This was the thing they had all promised would kill her. The thing Crane had smiled about behind his desk. The thing that would find her froze stiff come spring. And inside her small room of stone, Cora Hale knelt before her little iron stove, and she lit her fire. The flames caught. They climbed. The small box of black iron, the one thing she could not have made, the heart of all her hopes, began to glow with a low and steady heat. She fed it carefully. Small seasoned pieces of pine, listening to the good clean crackle, watching the smoke draw smoothly up the pipe and away into the screaming dark. And the stone began to warm, slowly, so slowly. The great cold mass of the mountain that had been her enemy all these weeks, that had cracked her hands and broken her back and chilled her to the bone, now turned at last into her one great ally. The stone drank the heat. It soaked it in, deep into its ancient body, and its temperature crept upward, hour by patient hour. And as it warmed, it began to give that warmth back, radiating it out, soft and steady and even, from every wall and floor and slab around her. Outside, the storm raged on. The wind howled. The snow piled deep against the ridge, against the juniper, against the canvas door, until it sealed her in behind a great soft wall of white, which, she understood, with quiet satisfaction, was only one more blanket, one more layer of warmth, packed tight by the very storm that meant to kill her. And inside, the widow was warm. She moved through her small chamber by the glow of the stove, and she added a single log when a single log was needed, no more, watching the little thermometer her husband had owned. And the needle held. It held, hour after hour, at a number that meant life. She cooked her beans and her salt pork on the iron top, and the good savory smell of it filled the warm, small space. She melted snow for water, and when the long dark came, she wrapped herself in quilt and wool, and she took out the journal, and she wrote by candlelight while the storm screamed itself hoarse against the unmoving stone. She wrote of the wind, and the cold, and the fire, And then she sat for a moment with the pencil still, and she understood something. Sitting there in the warm heart of the mountain, while death raged blind and furious a few feet away on the other side of the stone. The storm that would have killed her, that would have torn a thin-walled shack to splinters and frozen a lesser shelter into a tomb, was nothing to her now. Nothing but a muffled roar on the far side of a wall she had built with her own two ruined and rebuilt hands. She was not merely surviving. She was safe. She was warm. She was home. She bent again to the page, and beneath all the careful accounting of wood and cold and time, she wrote one last line that night. And her hand was steady, and her heart was steadier still. "It works," she wrote, "just as you said it would. The mountain holds, the fire holds, and so do I." And out in the howling dark, the storm threw itself again and again against the ancient stone, and the ancient stone did not so much as tremble. And deep inside it, behind a wall of fitted granite, and a door of canvas, and a great soft drift of snow, a small warm light burned on, all through the long wild night, and did not go out. For a long while after the first great test, the world belonged only to her. The storm that had come to kill her had passed on, beaten, and left behind it a silence so deep and so complete that it pressed against her ears like a hand laid gently over them. The valley below lay buried under a sea of white. The mountains stood still and pale beneath a hard, bright, pitiless sky. And the widow moved through her days alone, a small, dark figure in a vast and frozen world, chopping her wood, hauling her water, walking her quiet rounds along the trail her own boots had carved into the snow. Days passed this way, then weeks. She lost the habit of counting them. Time up there did not move the way it moved in the town below. It did not run on bells and shifts and the long blast of the mine whistle. It ran on light and dark, on cold and colder, on the slow, steady sinking of the woodpile in the outer room. She thought sometimes that the town had forgotten her. She thought that if anyone down there thought of her at all, they thought of a woman long gone, fled to the cities before the snows came, like a sensible woman, or else frozen stiff in a crack in the rock, the way the big man had sneered she would be, waiting now for the spring thaw to give up her body. The thought did not trouble her. She had become a creature of the mountain. Her life ran by the sun and the cold and the slow burning of her fire, and there was a kind of peace in that, hard-won and strange, that the old warm life had never given her. She had learned the language of the high country, its long silences, its sudden furies, the small signs it gave before it turned, and she had learned to answer it in kind, with patience, with care, with the steady, unglamorous work of staying alive one more day, and then one more. She was not happy. Happiness was a word from the other life, the warm life, the life with a quiet man laughing low beside the stove. But she was something else now, something she had not been before. She was whole. She was strong. She was entirely and finally her own. And then, deep in the dead and frozen heart of the winter, the mountain made its second attempt. This one did not come gently. There were no lazy drifting flakes this time, no slow gathering of the dark. The morning broke strange and yellow and wrong. The same sickly light that had warned her once before, but heavier now, lower, as though the whole sky had come down to rest its weight upon the peaks. The stillness was not a held breath this time. It was a held scream. She felt it in her teeth. She felt it in the old healed cracks of her hands, the way some people feel a change of weather in their bones. And she knew, with a certainty as deep and cold as the stone around her, that the thing coming now was worse than anything that had come before. Far worse. So she made ready, as she had made ready once before. She checked the clay seal where her pipe passed through the rock, and found it hard and tight. She brought in armload after armload of wood and stacked it close beside the stove, within reach of her hand. She filled every vessel she owned with melted snow. She latched the heavy canvas door and tested it against the frame. And then she sat. And she waited for the mountain to come for her again. When it broke all at once. The wind did not rise. It arrived. A single great wall of it, slamming into the ridge with a force she felt through the very floor. A deep, shuddering blow that made the whole mountain seem to lean beneath the weight of it. And on the back of the wind came the snow, not falling now but flying, driven flat and sideways in a screaming white torrent that swallowed the world in the space of a single breath. The light died. It was not night, but it might as well have been. The day went black as the storm closed its fist around the high country, and the cold that rode inside it was a cold past all the others. A deep, patient, hungry cold. The kind that does not nip or bite, but simply reaches into a living thing and quietly stops it. And far below, in the thin-walled town, that cold went hunting for the weak. The houses down there had never been made for such a night. They had been flung up cheap and quick, of green wood and thin board, with gaps in the walls a child could pass a hand through, and roofs the wind found easy work. They had been cold all winter long, and now, in the teeth of the great storm, they began, one by one, to fail. The wind tore at their corners. The cold crept through their seams. Families pressed together in the dark around stoves that could not keep ahead of the killing air, feeding the flames with whatever they had left, watching the white frost climb the inside of their own walls like something alive. And in one such house, on the very edge of the town, where the wind came hardest and cruelest off the open ground, a young woman sat in the dark and watched her child begin to slip away. Her name was Della. She was young, far younger than the widow on the mountain. She had a husband down in the deep dark of the mine, riding out the storm in the warm belly of the rock with the other men, with no way of knowing what was happening above. And she had a little one. A small son, not yet 3 years old, who had been fretful and warm for 2 days now, and who burned tonight with a fever that frightened her. His breath gone thin and quick and rattling in his small chest. Their wood was gone. What little had remained was a frozen, useless block, buried in a drift the storm had thrown against the house. They had burned the last of the dry. They had burned a chair. They had burned the slats from the boy's own small bed, one by one, watching the flames take them. And now, there was nothing left. Nothing left to feed the fire. And the fire was dying. And as it died, the cold came in. Della gathered her son into her arms, wrapped in every blanket the house could give. and she felt the warmth leaving the room, leaving the walls, leaving her own body where the boy lay against her. And she understood, with the terrible clear sight that comes to a mother in the dark, that if nothing changed, this night would take them both before the morning. There was no help in the town. Every house was its own small fortress under siege. No one could cross the open ground in that storm and live to reach another door. There was no one who could come, no one who could spare what they themselves did not have. The whole wide world had shrunk down to the small failing circle of her own 2 arms, and into that small failing circle, a memory came, a story, a thing she had half heard in the warm, bright days before the snows, told around the store and the well and the wash line. A story half believed and half laughed at. The tale of a widow who had gone up the mountain alone and had not died. A woman living in the rock. A place that stayed warm, they said, when all the world around it froze. The mad widow. The woman who understood the cold. Della looked down at her son's flushed, slack face, and she made the only choice a mother could make. She wrapped the boy tighter still until only his small face showed. She bound him hard against her chest with a long strip of cloth, the way the women of the old country once carried their young to leave their hands free. She pulled on every garment she owned, one over another. And then she set her hand to the door of her dying house and opened it and stepped out into the storm. It was madness. It was the particular madness that only love can make. The wind struck her like a living wall and tried to throw her flat. The snow filled her eyes and her mouth and packed itself against her face. The cold reached into her the instant she left the door, and she knew, with a calm that frightened her, that she had only so long out here. An hour, perhaps. Likely less. But she had a faint memory of a trail, a path beaten into the snow over long weeks by a widow's patient boots, that the new snow had not yet wholly erased. And she had the dark shape of the ridge fixed in her mind, the place where the stories said the woman lived. And against her chest, beneath her chin, she had her son's quick, thin, rattling breath. So she bent her head into the wind, and she climbed. High above her, behind a wall of fitted stone, Cora Hale sat warm beside her fire and did not know that anyone was dying in the dark below her. She was reading, as she did, the journal open on her knee, the candle steady, the great storm reduced to a deep, muffled roar on the far side of the rock. A roar that could not reach her, could not touch her, could not so much as stir the small flame of her candle. She had made her peace with the long night ahead. She had wood. She had warmth. She had her husband's careful words and her own hard-earned safety. She would ride this storm out the way she had ridden out the last, alone and warm and unafraid. And then she heard it. At first she took it for the wind. The wind found new voices all the time in the cracks and seams of the stone. But it came again, and it was not the wind. It was a sound that did not belong to any storm, a pounding, slow and weak and already fading. The sound of a fist beating against her canvas door. She was on her feet before she had decided to move. She crossed the small chamber in 2 strides, and she tore the door open, and the storm reached in through the gap and seized her, and the cold poured into her warm, small world like dark water flooding a breached hull. And there, slumped against the stone at the mouth of her shelter, half buried already beneath the driving snow, was a shape, a woman, barely standing, barely awake, iced over from head to foot, her face gone gray, her lips blue, swaying on her feet like a thing about to fall, and bound hard against her chest, wrapped in a frozen, sodden bundle. A child. For one terrible instant, the widow did not move. And in that instant, something rose up in her. Something cold and hard and honest that had carried her up this mountain and kept her alive through all the long, dark weeks. And it spoke to her in the flat, clear voice of pure survival. It said, "Your wood is counted." It said, "You measured it yourself, log by log, by candlelight. Every stick is an hour. Every armload is a night. You know exactly how many nights stand between you and the spring thaw, and there is not one to spare. Not one." It said, "Open that door, and the warmth you built with 6 weeks of your own broken hands pours out into the storm. Take in 2 more bodies, 2 more mouths of cold to thaw. Spend your fire faster than you can ever earn it back, in the dead of winter, when there is no more wood to be had, and no way down the mountain to fetch it." It said, "You could die for this. You could be the one found frozen stiff come spring, your last log burned too soon, all for the sake of one night, one open door, 2 strangers the world has already given up for dead." It said, "You owe them nothing. The town cast you out. These are the people of the town. They laughed and they waited for the cold to finish you. And now the cold has come for one of them instead. Close the door. It would take only a moment. The woman is nearly gone already. No one would ever know. No one would ever blame a widow alone on a mountain for a stranger who died in a storm. Close the door and live." Cora Hale stood in the roaring cold, her hand upon the frame, and she looked at the gray, dying face of the young mother, and she looked at the small, frozen bundle bound against her chest, and she made her choice. She reached out, and she took hold of the woman, and she pulled her in. "Come," she said, "come inside. Come into the warm." And she shut the storm out behind them. What followed was a war. The widow had won her first war against the cold with patience and planning and long, slow weeks of labor. This one she would have to win in a single night, with everything she had. And even that might not be enough. She got them both down onto the floor by the stove, into the very heart of the radiant warmth. She stripped the frozen outer things from the young mother with quick, sure hands and wrapped her in dry wool. She built the fire up high, higher than she had ever let herself build it, feeding it log after precious log, watching her counted woodpile begin to shrink before her eyes. And she did not let herself count. But it was the child she feared for most. She took the small bundle gently from the mother's stiff arms, and she unwrapped it there beside the fire, and her heart turned over in her chest. The boy was so small, so hot with fever, and yet so cold to the touch. That terrible joining of fire and ice that she had seen once before, long ago, in the old warm life, and had prayed on her knees never to see again. His breath came thin and quick and rattling. His eyes were half open and saw nothing at all. He was very far away. The cold and the storm and the long, terrible climb had carried him almost to the edge of that place from which the small ones do not return. Now, Cora Hale had no children of her own. That, too, was a grief she carried, quietly, the way she carried all her griefs, folded small and put away. But she knew the shape of this. She knew what it meant when a little one's breath went thin and quick like this. And she knew that on this night, in this storm, she was the only thing in all the world that stood between this child and the dark. So she did not let herself be afraid. Fear was a fire that burned all your fuel and gave back no heat. She had taught herself that long ago at a cold kitchen table with a cruel letter folded under her hand. She went to work. She warmed him slowly. That was the secret of it. The thing some part of her had always known, and the rest of her had learned from her husband's patient ways. Never too fast. You bring a frozen thing back to life the way the spring brings back the ground. Slowly, gently, by degrees. She held his small body against the warmth of her own. She wrapped flat stones from the edge of the hearth in cloth, just warm, never hot, and tucked them close around him. She melted snow and warmed it in her own mouth and wet his cracked lips with it, drop by patient drop. The young mother, coming back to herself now in the heat, tried to help, tried to hold him, and the widow let her, because a sick child should feel his mother's arms. But it was Cora who kept the watch. It was Cora who tended the fire and turned the stones and counted the small breaths. And the woodpile burned down. She watched it go through the long black hours, and she could not stop the grim accounting from running on behind her eyes. So many nights gone into the flames. So many days of her own hard-bought survival, fed away to keep two strangers breathing. The careful margin she had built with 6 weeks of bleeding labor, the buffer between herself and the spring, burning down before her, log by counted log. She did not stop feeding the fire. She had made her choice at the door. She would not unmake it now, in the dark, when it grew hard. Whatever it cost. Whatever came of it in the lean weeks ahead. She had looked into a dying child's face, and she had chosen, and a choice made at the door must be kept by the fire, or it was never a choice at all. And so the long night ground on, and the storm went on, screaming against the stone, and the small thin breath in the small thin chest went on, catching and stuttering and going on, rising and falling in the firelight, while a woman who owed the world nothing knelt upon the cold stone floor and gave that child everything she had to give. Toward the very end of the night, in the blackest, coldest hour, the one that comes just before the dawn. The boy grew worse. His breath went so thin she had to lean close to hear it at all. His small body went limp and heavy in her hands, and the young mother, who had held herself together through all that long terror, broke at last. She bent low over her child, and she began to weep. The deep, silent, shaking weeping of a mother watching her whole world slip away into the dark. And in that hour, even Cora Hale felt something in her own chest begin to fail. She had been so sure, so steady, but the breath was so thin now, and the small body so still, and she felt the cold certainty creeping up on her that perhaps she had not been enough, that perhaps the storm and the cold had taken too much of him before ever he reached her door, that perhaps all her warmth and all her knowing and all her stubborn refusal to despair would not be enough to call him back. And in that hour, She reached for the only thing she had ever had to lean on. She thought of her husband. She thought of his patient hands and his quiet voice and the long evenings he had spent bent over his book of noticings, writing down the slow, true workings of the world. She thought of how he had once told her, on a winter night long gone, that the mountain did not save itself with great violent heat, but with patience, with a slow, steady holding of warmth, given back a little at a time, through the long, cold dark, slow and steady and patient. That was how the stone did it. That was how it held a fire through a freezing night. And so that was how she would hold this child. She gathered them both into her arms, the mother and the small, failing son. She held them close against the warmth of her own body, in the warmth of the stone, in the warmth of the fire she had built with her own 2 hands against the dark. She held them the way the mountain held her, patient and unmoving and warm at the core. And she set her cheek against the small, hot head, and she began to speak, low and steady, the way you speak to a thing you are calling back from very far away. "Stay," she said. "Stay here, little one. Stay where it's warm. The cold doesn't get in here. Not past these walls. Not past me. You're safe now. You're home now. Just stay and breathe and stay." She did not know if he could hear her. She did not know if anything could reach so far into the dark as the place where he had gone. But she held them, and she kept the fire, and she said the words, over and over, low and steady and sure, all through the last black hour of that endless, screaming night. Just breathe, and stay, and breathe. And the fire burned, and the great stone held its warmth, exactly as a quiet man had once said it would. And somewhere out beyond the wall, the storm at last began, very slowly, to lose its voice. Dawn came gray and quiet and merciful. The wind had fallen sometime in that last dark hour, so gradually that she had not marked the moment it died. And now, a thin, pale light was creeping in around the edges of the canvas door, and the great roar that had filled the whole world for a night and a day had softened to a distant, sighing hush. The storm had passed, and in the small, warm chamber of stone, 3 people were still alive. The widow felt it before she understood it. A change in the small body in her arms, the terrible limpness gone, the dreadful thinness of the breath easing, deepening, slowing into something steadier, something stronger, something that rose and fell with the deep, even rhythm of true and ordinary sleep. The fever had broken in the night. The child was sleeping. The child was going to live. Cora Hale looked down at the small face, flushed no longer with fever, but only now with warmth. The small mouth gone slack, the small chest rising and falling, deep and slow and certain. And the young mother lifted her head and saw her sleeping son, and then looked up at the widow who had pulled them both from the jaws of the storm. And there were no words anywhere in any language that could have carried what was in that look. She did not try to find them. She only reached out and took the widow's hard and weathered hand in both of her own, and pressed it to her wet cheek, and wept. Not the weeping of grief now, but the other kind, the kind that comes only when the very worst has passed, and the heart is left too full to hold itself together. And Cora Hale, who had not wept before another living soul since the day they carried her husband down off the high north face, felt her own eyes sting and blur and overflow. She did not pull her hand away. She let it stay there, pressed warm against the young mother's cheek. And she looked at the sleeping child who would see the spring after all. And she understood, in that gray and quiet dawn, a thing that all her careful accounting had never once been able to teach her. The wood she had burned was not lost. It had become this small slow breath, this sleeping child, this warm hand holding hers. This was what the fire had been for, all along. Not only to keep one stubborn widow alive in the dark, but to be given, to be shared, to be spent when the moment came, on the saving of a life. And no margin, no buffer, no carefully counted woodpile in all the wide cold world had ever been worth so much as that. Word of it came down off the mountain with the melting of the drifts. Della carried it herself when she went home at last with her son alive and warm in her arms. And she did not tell it the old way, half laughing, half scornful, the way the tale of the mad widow had always been told. She told it the other way, the honest way. She told them what she had found up there in the heart of the killing storm, a warm room of stone, glowing in the firelight, when every house in the town had stood freezing. A fire that held when all their fires had failed. A woman who had opened her door to a stranger in the dead of the worst night of the winter, and had burned her own survival, log by precious log, to call a dying child back from the dark. And the laughter stopped. The whole town had ridden out that great storm, and the whole town had paid for it. There was hardly a family that had not suffered through it. Frozen pipes and failed stoves and long terrible nights spent feeding the furniture to the flames. They had all of them, every one, stared down into the same dark that Della had stared into. And up on the mountain, in a crack in the rock that the company had called worthless ground, a cast-out widow had stayed warm. She came back first, the young mother, days later, when the way had cleared, and this time she came not in desperation, but in something close to reverence. She brought what small thanks she could carry, and then, shy and halting, she asked the thing she had truly climbed the mountain to ask. How? How did the widow make the fire hold? How did she keep the warmth? How had she done, alone in a crack in the rock with her own two hands, the thing the whole town with all its houses could not do? Cora Hale looked at her for a long moment, and she did not gloat. There was a part of her, perhaps, some small and human part, that might have. These were the people who had cast her out, who had laughed and waited for the cold to finish her. And now they came climbing back up her trail, hat in hand, to ask the mad widow for her secrets. But she did not gloat, because when she looked into the young mother's earnest, frightened, hopeful face, she did not see one of the people who had wronged her. She saw a reflection of herself. She saw a woman alone against the cold, doing everything within her power to keep the ones she loved alive. She saw her own desperation of those first dark days, handed back to her now in another woman's eyes. And how could she close her hand against that? How could she meet that with anything but the open palm? So she opened it. She took the young mother outside, and with a stick she drew shapes in the snow, and she taught her how to stack a woodpile so the air moved freely through it and dried the wood even in the dead heart of winter. How to split a log to reach the dry, true heart of it. how to build a fire that ran hot enough to dry the next day's fuel, even as it burned the last. And then she went to her own woodpile, her own precious, hard-won, fire-thinned woodpile that she had counted and grieved over in the long night. And she chose out the best and driest of what little remained, and she bundled it up in her arms, and she pressed it into the young mother's hands. "Use this to start," she said. "Get a good hot fire going, hot enough to dry the rest as it burns. The cold isn't beaten with more wood, child. It's beaten with knowing." The young mother wept again, the tears freezing bright on her cheeks, and she carried the wood and the knowing back down the mountain to her home. After that, they came, one by one at first, and then in twos and threes. The people of the town that had cast her out climbed the beaten trail to the crack in the rock. They did not come for charity. They were too proud for that. The very same as she was. They came for something else. They came to learn. An old man came whose stovepipe choked black with tar and would not draw. She showed him how to build his fire hot enough to burn the foulness away, and how to seal his pipe against every draught the way she had sealed her own, with clay packed hard into each crack and seam. A young couple came whose walls let the wind pass straight through like a sieve. She told them how to bank the snow high against the outside, how to stuff each gap with what they had, how to make of their thin, cold company house a warmer thing than the company had ever bothered to build. Another widow came, frightened and alone, and gray with grief. And to her, Cora gave more than knowledge. She gave an afternoon by the warm stove, a cup of coffee held in two cold hands, and the simple, wordless proof, sitting there in that glowing room of stone, that a woman alone could do far more than merely endure the cold, that a woman alone could build something that held. One by one they came, and one by one she taught them. She did not become a saint. She did not pretend the old wrong had never been done. She remembered the letter still. She remembered the cold, quiet morning when a man with a pen had decided she was no longer of any use. She remembered the big man at her door and the word he had thrown at her like a stone. Mad. She remembered all of it. But she had found a thing larger than her own remembering. She had found that the knowledge her husband had loved into being, the patient noticing he had given his quiet life to, the warmth she had built with her own ruined and rebuilt hands, was not a thing meant to be hoarded against the dark. It was a thing meant to be given away. And the strange truth of it was this. The more of it she gave, the more there seemed to be. Far below, Crane heard of it too. Word reached even him that the widow he had set aside had not died at all, that she lived up there on his company's worthless ground, that half the town was climbing the mountain now to learn at the feet of the woman he had thrown away. It did not please him. There was something in it that sat in him like a stone in a shoe, a line he had drawn clean, refusing now to stay drawn. But that was a reckoning still to come. For now the widow was no longer the pitiable thing they had pitied. She was no longer the mad woman in the crack in the rock, the one they had laughed at and waited to see carried down stiff in the spring. She was the woman of the mountain, the one who had looked the great cold full in its face and had not been afraid, the one who understood the winter and knew how to fight it, and would teach you to fight it too. if you were only willing to climb the trail and ask. The cast out had become the cornerstone, and in the evenings, when the last of them had gone back down to their warmer homes, she would feed her thinned fire one careful log and take out her husband's journal and write. She wrote of the storm and the child and the long night's vigil in the dark. She wrote of the young mother's tears and the small breath caught back from the very edge. And then she wrote of all the others, the ones who came after, climbing her trail to learn the things she had to teach. And beneath it all, in her hard, small, steady hand, she set down a single line. They cast me out into the cold, she wrote, and the cold made me into the one thing they could not do without. Then she set down the pencil, and she looked at the warm stone walls glowing soft around her, the walls that had been her enemy and become her ally, and become at last her home. And far below, in a small warm house on the edge of the sleeping town, a child who should not have lived breathed slow and deep and safe, because one terrible winter night, a woman the whole world had thrown away had opened her door to the storm and chosen to give when she had every reason left under heaven to keep. The thaw came slowly that year, the way it always does in the high country, not all at once, not in a single warm rush, but a little at a time, a dripping from the south-facing eaves at midday, going silent again by dusk, a patch of dark wet earth appearing at the foot of a sunlit stone, the creek beginning to murmur somewhere beneath its lid of ice, a small secret voice returning at last to a world that had been silent for so long. And the widow felt the thaw moving in herself too, slowly, by degrees, but she felt it. She had gone into that winter a woman hollowed out by grief, with nothing left but a fistful of coins and a cold house and a deadline pressing down on her like the weight of the snow. She had gone into it expecting, if she was honest, to die, and meaning, if she had to die on her own terms, with her hands busy and her chin up. And here she still was, alive, strong, changed past all recognizing, standing in the soft returning light of the spring like a thing that had been buried all winter and was only now, slowly, being uncovered. And then, with the thaw, a stranger came up the valley. He came from somewhere far away, somewhere down where the company kept its great offices and its maps, and the men who drew the clean, cold lines that governed the lives of people they would never meet and never have to look in the eye. His name was Julian Reed. He was a man of middle years, sober and quiet, with the careful, patient eyes of someone who had spent his whole life studying how things were built, and more to the point, why they failed. He had been sent up to that mountain town for a single reason. The winter there had gone badly, far too badly. The mine had nearly ground to a stop. Families had suffered, and some had packed what they could carry and left, and Crane's tidy reports blaming the cruelty of the weather had at last begun to wear thin in the warm rooms below. So they had sent Reed to find the truth of it, and he was a thorough man. He measured the thin walls of the company houses with his own hands. He weighed the poor, damp, grudging fuel the families had been given to burn. He sat at their tables and he listened. And the more he listened, the clearer and the uglier the picture grew. The houses had been built cheap and cold and cruel. The suffering had not been an act of God. It had been a choice, a corner cut to save a little money, paid for in other people's warmth. But there was one story Reed kept hearing that did not fit anywhere in his neat columns of failure. A story about a widow, a woman who had gone up the mountain alone with almost nothing, and had lived. A woman in a crack in the bare rock whose single small fire had held all winter long when the whole town's fires had failed around her. The mad widow, a few of them still called her, out of old worn habit. But they did not say it the old way now. They said it with something underneath it. Something that sounded, when Reed listened closely, very much like wonder. At first he set it aside. It had the shape of a tale, the kind of bright, impossible story that takes root in lonely, cold places and grows and gets passed hand to hand to keep people warm through the long dark. But the old man who kept the store would not let it go. "You want to understand how a body survives a winter up here," the old man told him, slow and certain, his hands resting flat upon the worn counter. "You go and you talk to her. She did the thing your whole company, with all its money and all its clever men, could not manage to do." And so, on a bright cold morning, with the snow gone soft and heavy underfoot, the engineer set out to climb the trail to the crack in the rock. He did not say much going up. The climb was hard, and the air was thin, and he was a man unused to mountains. And when at last he reached the top, he found he had nothing to say at all. For a long while, he simply stood there, looking at the trail, beaten smooth and sure by weeks of patient feet, at the heavy canvas door, set neat and snug into the living face of the stone, at the thin, clean ribbon of smoke rising from a flue so cleverly hidden you would never find it if you did not know to look. And then at the woman herself, who had come out to meet him, standing straight and steady at the mouth of her shelter, her weathered hands hanging easy at her sides, her eyes calm and level, and entirely unafraid of the man from the warm rooms below. He asked with great respect whether he might come inside. He was an engineer, he explained, and what she had built here was of real interest to a man of his trade. She looked at him a moment, weighing him. Then she stepped aside and let him pass. He ducked low through the narrow door and straightened up inside the small, warm chamber, and the breath simply went out of him. He did not see a crude hole in the rock. He did not see the desperate last resort of a woman with nowhere else to go. He saw a thing made right. He ran his hands slowly along the dry, stacked wall she had raised, stone by patient stone, and he understood at once what it was for. He felt the deep, steady, even warmth radiating out of the great mass of the surrounding rock, soaking the small room in it, and he understood that too. He crouched to study the clay seal where her stovepipe passed through the stone, hard and tight and seamless, and a slow look of astonishment spread across his careful face. "You made a buffer," he said quietly, half to himself. "A cold room, to hold the warm room safe. You let the stone itself do the labor of keeping you alive." He shook his head slowly. "It's elegant. It's better than the things we build with brick and mortar and a great deal of money." He turned to her. "Do you understand what you have done here?" he asked, and there was no mockery in it, only a kind of helpless wonder. And then his eye fell upon the journal. It lay where it always lay, beside the stub of candle. He asked if he might look. She allowed it, and he opened it and turned slowly to the pages at the back, her own pages. The careful accounting set down through the long winter in a small, steady hand. The wood burned each day, the cold without, the warmth within, recorded faithfully, day after day after day. And the wonder on his face deepened into something close to reverence. "You kept records," he murmured. "You measured all of it. You knew every single day exactly what you had, and exactly what it would cost you to spend it." He looked up at her, and the polite professional interest he had climbed the mountain wearing was wholly gone now. In its place was something else, something far rarer. Respect. The clear, level respect of one person for another. "There are men with years of training," he said slowly, "who never learn what you taught yourself, alone, in a single winter, with no one to show you, no one to help you, nothing but your own two hands and your own clear mind." And then he said the thing that no one, in all that long, cold, brutal year, had ever once said to her. He looked at her plainly. He said it simply, and he meant every word of it down to the bone. "What you have done here has value, Mrs. Hale, real value, the kind that a person ought to be paid for, and thanked for, and honored for." She did not answer right away. She had been called a great many things that winter: pitiable, mad, a trespasser, a squatter living in a crack in the rock like an animal, a part the town no longer had any use for. But no one had ever said that. No one had looked at her long, cold, desperate, lonely work of staying alive and named it for what it truly was: a thing of skill, a thing of knowing, a thing of worth, deserving of respect. She felt something shift in her chest at the words, something she had believed frozen solid, for good and all. "My husband saw it first," she said at last, her voice low and even. "Up on the high slope one summer. He found the crack in the rock, and he understood what it was, and he wrote it all down. Not because it was useful to anyone, but only because he loved it." She rested her weathered hand, just for a moment, upon the worn leather cover of the journal. "I only finished," she said softly, "what he had the eyes to notice. What came after came quietly. The engineer went back down the mountain, and he wrote his report, and the truth that had lain buried all winter long came up, at last, into the light. He laid it all bare, the cheap walls, the poor fuel, the suffering that never should have happened, and would not have happened, but for the cutting of a corner here and a corner there. And against all of it, like a quiet and unanswerable judgment, he set down the simple fact of a single widow, alone in a crack in the rock, who had done with nothing what the whole company could not do with everything. Silas Crane was called down to the warm rooms below. He was not destroyed. Such men rarely are. But the line he had drawn so cleanly through one woman's life was, in the end, drawn straight through the middle of his own. He was moved aside, sent off somewhere small and distant and forgettable, where his signature would settle nothing more important than the count of crates upon a loading dock. The same hand that had written out her eviction would write nothing that mattered to anyone, ever again. Cora Hale heard of it in time, and it is a strange thing to tell. She felt no great rush of triumph at the news. She had thought she would. Through the long, dark weeks, in the very bitterest hours, she had pictured this moment more than once. The man who had cast her out into the cold, brought low at last. And she had been certain it would taste like something sweet, but when it finally came, it tasted of almost nothing at all. Because somewhere in the long course of that winter, without her ever quite marking the moment of it, his power to wound her had simply ended. He had grown small. Not because he had been punished, but because she had quietly grown past the whole reach of him. What he had done to her had once meant the entire world. On a freezing morning at a kitchen table, with a paring knife in her hand, and the grief still raw in her chest. It meant nothing to her now. And that was a freedom worth more than 100 revenges. The company offered her work. The engineer himself carried the offer up the mountain, a real position and real wages with it. A chance to teach the whole settlement what she knew. To make the houses warm and sound before the next winter came down off the peaks, so that no other mother would ever again have to carry a dying child up a mountainside through a storm in the dark. She thought about it for a long while, and then she said yes, but she said it on her own terms and not on theirs. She would not move back down into one of the company houses, warm now or not. She would keep her shelter in the rock. It was hers. She had quarried it out of her own grief, and raised it with her own bleeding hands, and finished it with her own stubborn refusal to lie down and let the cold have her. It was the truest home she had ever known, and she would not give it up for anyone. There was one errand, though, that she had been saving. One bright morning, before the work began, she walked the old handcart back down to the store and set it by the door, exactly where it had always stood. The wheels were worn, the wood scuffed from a hard winter's use, but it had carried what it needed to carry, and it had come home. The old man came out, drying his hands on his apron, and looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say anything at all. He only nodded, slow and certain, the way a man nods when a bet he was proud to make has come good. And then he stepped back and held the door and put the kettle on. So each morning, through that long, bright spring, she walked down the mountain into the town. And each evening, she climbed back up to the stone. And when she taught them, she did not give orders. That was never her way. She did not stand over the men with her arms folded and point in command. She knelt down beside them in the cold dirt, and she showed them. She set her own hard hands to the work alongside theirs. She taught the way her quiet husband had once taught her, on long winter evenings by a kitchen stove, patiently and plainly, as one person handing to another a thing worth the knowing. She showed them how to bank a house against the wind, how to seal a wall so the cold could not creep through the seams of it, how to stack and dry a winter's worth of wood so it would burn when the burning mattered, how to build a fire that ran hot enough to dry tomorrow's fuel, even as it warmed you tonight. By mid-spring, there was hardly a roof in the valley she had not set her hands to, the houses on the cruel north edge where the wind had always punished hardest. The cramped quarters of the unmarried men who had never once thought to ask a woman anything, and learned. The home of a family who had nearly given up and gone, and now decided to stay. One by one she made them sound, and one by one, the families who had once looked straight through her, learned at last to meet her eyes. And the town that had cast her out into the snow, began slowly to take her in. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way the thaw itself had happened, by small things. A nod where before there had only been a turned back. A quiet word where before there had been a careful silence. A child waving shyly from an open doorway as she passed. A warm loaf of bread left without a word upon the flat stone outside her shelter, still faintly steaming in the cold morning air. The small, ordinary daily gestures by which a hard place finally lets a person understand that she has become, somehow, one of its own. And the young mother came often, Della, whose small son had breathed his way back from the very edge of the dark on a screaming winter night, in the warmth of a stranger's arms. She came up the mountain with the boy riding on her hip, again and again, all through the spring, not to learn anything now, only to sit a while by the warm stove and talk of small ordinary things, and let the child toddle and play on the worn stone floor of the very room where his life had been given back to him. And Cora Hale, who had spent an entire winter certain she was alone in all the world, discovered to her own quiet astonishment that she was not alone any longer. The hard shell she had grown, the one that had let her survive, began very gently to soften, not to break, never to break. The strength stayed in her, deep and permanent. The hardness had saved her life, and she would not be ashamed of it, nor wish a single day of it undone. But beneath that hardness, something that had been frozen solid through all that long and brutal year began at last to thaw. And then, on a warm afternoon, late in the spring, she walked up the small green hill that rose above the town. The snow was long gone from there now. The earth lay soft and dark and breathing, and the first new grass was pushing up through it, impossibly tender and green, and a scatter of early flowers had opened their small faces to the gentle sun. She came to a simple cross of weathered wood, and she stood before it a long while in the warm and golden light. She had come to this hill so often through the bitter days, in the depths of her grief, in the white heat of her fury, in the cold grip of a need she could never quite put a name to. She had come here hard and frozen and full of something that had no bottom, but she did not feel those things now. The cold had gone out of her. The fury had burned itself clean away, somewhere in a long winter of labor and warmth, and giving more than she could spare. What she felt now, standing there in the soft light, was something quieter. She knelt down, and she laid her weathered hand flat upon the cool new grass. "You left me a map," she said softly. "Did you know that? When you climbed up there with your little book and knelt down and drew that crack in the rock, did you have any idea you were leaving me a way to live?" The wind moved gently through the new grass. It carried the smell of thawing earth and the small green promise of the coming summer. "I thought you'd left me nothing," she said. "That morning the letter came. I sat at your table, and I thought I had nothing in all the world but a few coins, and an empty house, and a winter coming down the mountain to kill me." She was quiet a moment. "But you'd left me everything," she said. "You're noticing? You're seeing? The way you loved every stone and root and feather and rock face on this whole hard mountain. That's the thing that saved me in the end. Not the cave, not the rock. You. The way you looked at the world, and the way you wrote it down." so carefully, so I could find it when I needed it most. She looked out over the valley, green now, and stirring, and alive. They came to me, you know, she said. In the end, the very ones who cast me out, they climbed my trail, and they stood at my door, and they asked me how, and I taught them, every one of them, the way you'd have wanted me to, the way you once taught me, by the stove, on the cold nights. A small soft sound escaped her then, that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, and was, in the end, somehow neither one. There's a little boy alive down there because of what you saw on this mountain, she said. A whole town warmer because of it. You're noticing, Elias, it's still keeping people alive, even now, even with you gone from me. It just goes on and on, warming people you never met and never will. She traced the grain of the weathered wood with one finger, slow and tender. I used to think the cold had turned me into stone, she said quietly, into granite, into something that couldn't be broken anymore, because it couldn't feel anything anymore. She shook her head slowly. But that's not the truth of it. I see that now. A stone just sits there in the cold. It doesn't build a thing. It doesn't keep a single soul warm through the night. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not made of granite, she said softly. I'm made of you, of every patient thing you ever taught me, and of everything I found out I could do, when at last there was no one left in all the world to do it for me. The afternoon light lay golden and long across the green hill, and Cora Hale knelt there in the warm new grass for a long, peaceful while, and she did not weep, and she did not rage, and she did not drown, this time, in her grief. She simply rested in the quiet company of the man she had loved, who was gone, and who was, somehow, not entirely gone, who lived on still, in every warm hearth in the valley below, in every wall she had taught a frightened family to seal against the dark, in the slow, steady, ordinary beat of one small heart that should have stopped on a winter night, and had not. After a while, she rose to her feet. She brushed the soft, dark earth from her knees. She looked once more at the simple weathered cross, and then out over the wide green valley spread below her, waking now from its long white sleep. And then she turned and began the slow walk back up the mountain, back to the shelter in the rock that was hers. The home she had built with her own hands, stone by stone, against the cold, where the little stove sat ready, and the canvas door hung true, and a small, soft, warm light could be kindled any evening against the coming on of any dark. She did not walk like a woman who had been broken, and had merely survived it. She walked like a woman who had been emptied all the way down to nothing, and had slowly, patiently, over one long, hard winter, filled herself back up again, with work, with knowing, with the warmth she had finally learned how to give, and, harder still, how to receive. The winter had taken so very much from her, but it had given her this, a home of her own making that no man with a pen could ever take away. A place at last among people who had once turned their backs and walked away, and the deep, quiet, unshakable peace of a woman who has done a hard and worthy thing, and done it well, who asked for nothing she had not earned with her own two hands, and who found, when the long cold finally broke, that she was not alone in the world after all. And somewhere below her, as the soft golden evening came down over the thawing valley. 100 small fires were being lit in 100 warmer homes, each one a little easier now to start and a great deal slower to die. Because one bitter winter, a woman the world had thrown away had refused, with everything that was in her, to let the cold have the last word. And the last word, in the end, was not the cold's at all. It was hers, and it was warm.